All right, you all can do better. Give it up for Condoleezza Rice, please. The woman flew from Korea to San Francisco, got off a plane, hopped on another plane to come to Boston, just so she could give this lecture series. Give it up one more time. It is my great pleasure to welcome you to this year's presentation of the Du Bois Lectures. Now, as you all know, this year's lectures are being delivered by former Secretary of State Condoleezza Rice. Dr. Rice comes to us this evening from Stanford University, where she's the Barbara and Thomas Stevenson Senior Fellow at the Hoover Institution. Now, the Du Bois Lectures are named for the greatest black intellectual of all time, William Edward Burghardt Du Bois, the first African American to earn the PhD in the history of Harvard. In fact, Dr. Du Bois, after earning a bachelor's degree in 1888 from Fisk, earned 3 degrees from Harvard: an A.B. in 1890, a master's degree in history in 1891, and the PhD in 1895. Between 1896 and 1963, he published 22 books. 22 books. And he held himself and others always to the highest level of intellectual achievement and political engagement. It is quite fitting, then, for Dr. Rice, who has risen to the highest reaches in both the academy and in politics, to deliver the 30th in our Du Bois Lecture Series. The Du Bois Lectures recognize scholars and thinkers who have contributed in profound ways to African American and American culture and society. On behalf of the Du Bois Institute, I'd like to thank the Kennedy School of Government's Institute of Politics for opening your doors to us and hosting Dr. Rice's first Du Bois Lecture. Dean David Elwood, my dear friend, will introduce Dr. Rice formally, so I'll turn this over to him. David Elwood has served as the Dean of the K School and the Scott M. Black Professor of Political Economy at Harvard for 6 years, and it has thrived under his leadership, and it is our pleasure to be in his house. Give it up for David Elwood.
Thank you, Skip. I'm thinking, what's wrong with this picture? I'm between Skip Gates and Condoleezza Rice on the podium. So I will try to be reasonably brief on something that's enormously difficult to do. Madam Secretary, welcome back to Harvard. It's a great honor to have you here. But before I do the formal introduction, I want to first welcome some very special guests that we have here at the Kennedy School this next few days, participating in the bipartisan program for newly elected members of Congress. First established in 1972. I would be very grateful if the 25 new members that are here, if you could stand up, and so that we can thank you. And by the way, we're counting on you. It's an amazingly important time in the country and in the world, and so we are very, very pleased that you've taken the time to be here with us. So let me just also say my thanks to Skip and to the Du Bois for the Du Bois series. I should mention that there are 2 more lectures, and tonight's speech is the first of 3. Tomorrow night, Secretary Rice will speak about multi-ethnic democracy. Is the American experience unique? And then on Thursday, she wraps up her series with a talk called Why Democracy Matters: Education, Empowerment, and the American National Myth at Home and Abroad. And both of these speeches will take place at Asquith Hall and are done in conjunction with the Harvard Graduate School of Education. So my thanks to them and to Secretary Rice, also the Institute of Politics. This is as complicated a logistical set of activities with all the different people as you can imagine. So I want to also thank Senator John Culver, who's the head of the Institute of Politics, as well as Noelia Rodriguez, Sean Turney, and Jeff Barnes, all for their fine work. If you could give them a hand as well. They do every night. They make the forum happen. Let me just say one last word before I introduce the Secretary. The Kennedy Schools Forum here is one of the premier venues, not only at Harvard, but around the country. And we have only one set of rules. And the set of rules is whoever speaks here must take unfettered questions from the audience. That's the rules. And in exchange, we have another rule. While they speak, they get to speak uninterrupted. And so I would just, if anyone chooses to violate those rules, I'm afraid we'll have to ask you to leave. This is a remarkable opportunity here, and people have their opportunity to ask questions afterwards. Now with that, I think everyone will want to hear every word, because Condoleezza Rice is the Thomas and Barbara Stevenson Senior Fellow in Public Policy at the Hoover Institution. She's a professor of political economy at Stanford School of Business and a professor of political science at Stanford University. Now that all by itself seems like a mouthful, but it's trivial compared to her true accomplishments. You know, I think all of the interesting problems of the world cross boundaries. They cross the boundaries between business and government and civil society. They cross boundaries among different ethnic and racial and religious, and they cross barriers across national borders. We have someone that has played in every one of those areas and has always done so with grace and with thoughtfulness and integrity. From 2005 to 2009, she served as the 66th Secretary of State of the United States. And prior to that, from January 2001 until 2005, she was the President's National Security Advisor. She was, prior to that, at Stanford University, where she served as a provost from 1993 to 1999. I'm not sure which job is harder, being the provost or being the Secretary of State. Maybe she can tell us about that. And she was also at the Hoover Institution both from 91 to 93, and again after she served as provost until 2001. But as a professor, she won 2 of the highest honors, the 1984 Walter J. Gores Award for Excellence in Teaching and the 1993 School of Humanities and Sciences Dean's Award for Distinguished Teaching. So not only has she done these extraordinary things, she's a spectacular teacher. She's co-authored several books, most recently Extraordinary, Ordinary People, my favorite book title in about 10 years. Extraordinary, Ordinary People, a Memoir of Family. Germany and Unified Europe Transformed, a study in statecraft with Philip Zelikow, the Gorbachev era, 1986, and so on. In addition to all these remarkable things, she's a member of several boards, including Chevron Corporation, the Charles Schwab Corporation, Transamerica, and so forth. She's on the International Advisory Board of J.P. Morgan. Well, that's really not enough to do because she's also a founding board member of the Center for a New Generation, an educational support fund for schools in East Palo Alto and East Menlo Park. And those of you that have been to Palo Alto know how critical and vital that kind of activity is. She's on many other activities ranging from the boards of the Commonwealth Club, the Aspen Institute, the John F. Kennedy Center for Performing Arts, Boys and Girls Clubs of America, and the like. But of course, she's best known because she's a very accomplished pianist. She has performed with Yo-Yo Ma. Though she is herself a chamber musician, she's also said to be a big fan of Led Zeppelin. Is that right? So I do know that you are doing a concert in the next day or two. So Stairway to Heaven on it would be great. But of course, most importantly, for those of us that care about football, she has one, frankly, mark against her and one positive one. The mark is that she's actually a fan of the Cleveland Browns, which here in Patriot country is challenging this year. But she is, for many people, the dream commissioner of the future. So with all of those things and no further ado, I would like to welcome our very honored guest, Secretary Condoleezza Rice.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Thank you. Well, David, thank you for that wonderful introduction. It seems I've tried a few things in my life, and indeed, I did have a chance as a pianist to play with Yo-Yo Ma, one of the great moments in my life. But let me just tell you, I was not confused. I was not playing with Yo-Yo Ma because I was a great pianist. I was playing with Yo-Yo Ma because I was the National Security Advisor. And it means I made a good decision when I changed my major from music. I would very much like to thank the Du Bois Institute and Professor Skip Gates, my good friend, for this great honor of delivering this year's Du Bois Institute lectures. I would like to thank the Institute for Politics for co-sponsoring this evening. And I'd like to thank you for all being here and engaging in what I hope will be a great dialogue about issues that face us in international politics and at home. But as I thought about what I'd like to talk about in this series of lectures named for the great Black American intellectual activist W.E.B. Du Bois, I thought about the spirit of the man. And it occurred to me that this was someone who, throughout his life, struggled in a very real way with the relationship between Africa and the Black diaspora as he saw it. He struggled with whether or not success was possible for Black Americans here in the United States in what were clearly very trying times, and his journey from the Northeast into the Deep South, of course, hardened his beliefs that perhaps blacks could not succeed, as he witnessed for the first time when he went to Fisk University, the really ugly side of racism. He nonetheless explored issues of whether or not a Black Renaissance might be led by the talented 10th. He was always looking for some way to make it work. You could talk about the concerns that he had. What of Africa? He explored Pan-Africanism. What of capitalism? He explored communism. And what of democracy and political representation and political rights for its most aggrieved citizens, the descendants of slaves? W. Du Bois was a complicated man with complicated views. And I think we only do justice to his memory in trying to understand not just how his complicated message and complicated views looked for the times in which he lived, but how do we think about those messages for the times in which we live? And so I've chosen to talk about three interrelated topics over the next few nights. I'm going to start talking tonight about Africa, where Du Bois perhaps would have started and where he, of course, ended his life in Accra in Ghana. I want to talk about the evolution of American policy toward Africa, the ups and downs in our attempts to come to a policy that both reflected our interest and our values. Tomorrow will talk a little bit about multi-ethnic democracy, because it seems to me that this concept of multi-ethnic democracy, that citizenship can somehow be divorced from ethnicity and nationality, is a modern concept of citizenship, and where else is that taking hold? And then on Thursday, I'd like to return home and to look at perhaps some of the questions that would have challenged and engaged Du Bois about education and the narrative in the United States that it doesn't matter where you came from, it matters where you're going. And I want to warn you, I have a family story that I think fits right into that thinking of how education and the narrative about coming from humble circumstances and doing great things, how that narrative has unfolded in American democracy. So now to the question of U.S. foreign policy and the continent of Africa. And of course, we all have to remind ourselves at the very beginning that Africa is not, of course, a country. Africa is a continent, and it has many, many different strains, many, many different countries, and many different peoples. And yet, it shares a history, with the exception of Ethiopia, of colonialism, a history on both coasts of the continent, and having had a slave trade in which, of course, the United States and Europe benefited. And so a policy toward Africa has always had a kind of edge to it when the United States addresses that question. Now, whenever I start a discussion of American foreign policy toward any place, I start by reminding us that when we try and think of American foreign policy as simply about interest, that is a balance of power, realism, as the realist school, as political scientists would talk about it, where really it doesn't matter what's inside a state, it's just the balance of power between states that matter. When we talk about American foreign policy only in those terms, we miss the fact that the United States is actually a deeply ideological country. Deeply ideological in almost everything that we do, and most certainly deeply ideological in foreign policy. And I don't just mean ideological in the sense of the competition with the Soviet Union, though I will get to that in a moment, something that I studied as a young scholar, but really ideological in the sense that America is first and foremost an idea. We are not bound together by religion. We are not bound together by ethnicity. We are not bound together by nationality. We are bound together by an idea. And that idea has permeated and penetrated American thought and American action. And so when we think only of balance of power, we create a straw man for American foreign policy. But of course, no foreign policy, particularly that of an important country, can exist simply on the basis of ideology alone as well. America is therefore both an idea and a superpower, and together, the ups and downs, the ins and outs of making those two strains in our foreign policy work together go very, very far back into our history. As a matter of fact, back to the beginning of our history, when Thomas Jefferson thought that, of course, the United States' only allies could be countries like France, which were republics, and of course he was shot down by the Federalists who believed that we had a more natural ally in Great Britain. So these strains go very far back in American policy. The tendency is stronger sometimes one way or the other, but in any given era, they exist side by side. And because the United States, particularly since the end of World War II, has had vast impact on the world and vast impact on peoples around the world, how we play out those two strains in our foreign policy has mattered. It has mattered greatly to the development of the international system, but development to the lives of individual people. Now, going back to the years of the Cold War, I think you can argue that policy toward Africa was pretty unabashedly reflecting the US rivalry with the Soviet Union. In fact, the tendency was more toward that argument about balance of power. Categorization of African countries came in a sense of whether or not they were anti-communist, whether or not they were willing to provide stability against the march of communism. It, of course, had its benefits in that it gave the United States a forward base, if you will, for its policies and for its views of how the world ought to come out. But of course, it had tremendous costs too. Most assuredly, it had great costs in South Africa, where the United States was late to come to an understanding of what was actually going on in South Africa with the fight against apartheid. And I can tell you that those scars still remain towards South Africa. When I dealt with US policy as secretary, for instance, with South African leaders, I found a strange little quirk in our law that dated to that time. It turns out that many members of the ANC were actually on the US terrorist list. And they were still on the US terrorist list when I became secretary in 2005. Now, you think about this, people like Nelson Mandela and the leaders of the ANC, and you wonder, why would this be the case? Because, of course, in the context of anti-communism of the 1970s, 1980s, and certainly earlier, this was how South Africa was thought of. I remember the embarrassment of learning this and learning that this meant that any time one of my colleagues, including the foreign minister of South Africa, wanted to come to the United States, there were extraordinary visa procedures that we had to go through. I then set about, with President Bush's support, trying to get rid of this, and it took us more than a year to finally get this removed from the US books. And so there were costs to this view. There were costs also in places like Angola, where the United States, of course, took the side of Jonas Savimbi. Of course, Savimbi did not win that war, and we've paid a cost in Angola and in the Horn of Africa. So there were costs. Now, it's interesting how deeply ingrained this was. I did my master's thesis at Notre Dame on the international economics side. And my master's thesis was actually, for those of you who are studying here at the Kennedy School, a great big regression that tried to explain the granting of Soviet and American aid to the Third World. And as I did the regression, the number one explanation for why the United States or the Soviet Union would grant aid was if the other did in some co-located country. So we tried in Africa to literally produce these client states that could compete with one another. The next most powerful explanation was ideological. If a country called itself communist, it was going to get Soviet aid. If it called itself capitalist and, quote, democratic, it was going to get American aid. And so it was very real, this competition in Africa out of the competition with the Soviet Union. Now, obviously, with the collapse of the Soviet Union, the redefinition of American interest had to begin. What were we going to do with no Soviet Union to compete with across the international community? But for a while, U.S. interests tended to lack clarity. The post-Cold War period went on for a really long time. And anytime you define a period as the post of something else, you can be pretty clear that you don't really know what it is. And so for a long time, we were in the post-Cold War period. Now, Africa in this post-Cold War period slipped more and more from the agenda. And the events in Somalia of 1992-1993 were in a way a kind of warning not to go there, and probably explain in part the inaction for which many leaders now who were in positions of authority at the time, the inaction in Rwanda, which haunts people who were in positions of authority at the time. And I have a lot, frankly, a lot of sympathy for those who did not act in Rwanda, because even though in retrospect, it was a tremendous genocide, even though in retrospect one wonders why the collective international community didn't do something. One can imagine the decision-making at the time. What were you to do? How were you to do it? It must have been very, very difficult indeed. But indeed, one of the saddest things that I saw as secretary was when we went to Rwanda, and they have there a genocide museum, and there was a note that had been found in the rubble. And it was from a little boy, about 8 years old, and it said, "Don't worry, the UN is coming." Well, of course, the UN never came. 1996 was also the low point for U.S. aid to Africa in 3 decades. And Africa fell into, in the U.S. National Security Strategy of 1996, the humanitarian category, meaning that we would deal with Africa as a noblesse oblige or as a humanitarian issue. It wasn't a matter of U.S. and African interest in common. It was certainly not even an issue of values. It was an issue of dealing with the humanitarian crises that were starting to affect the continent. Now, in 2000 and 2001, we did want to, when President Bush asked me to be his foreign policy chief, we did want to begin to redefine policy toward Africa, but quite frankly, it was also principally still around a humanitarian agenda and a development agenda of a rather mild sort. You might remember that President Bush in the debates, the second presidential debates in 2000, supported debt relief for Africa. 4 months after he was in office, we helped to set up the Global Fund for AIDS Relief with a $200 million contribution from the United States, and so on and so on. But when 9/11 happened and U.S. interest became redefined worldwide, not just around terrorism, but also around the notion that we needed to have responsible sovereigns in the world, that failed states were a danger, not just to themselves, but a danger to international stability. After all, Afghanistan had been the kind of quintessential failed state. It had been unable to control its territory. Terrorists had burrowed in there. And you learn something very interesting about failed states, which is that the same thing that makes them vulnerable to being safe havens for terrorists makes them vulnerable to being safe havens for drug runners, being safe havens for arms dealers, and in fact being safe havens for trafficking in persons. Because corrupt officials, the inability of the government to control territory, and the inability of the international system effectively to count on what my colleague Steve Krasner has called responsible sovereignty, is a problem not just for those states, but for the international system as a whole. And so we set about trying to think about, and not just the United States, the international community as a whole, what responsible sovereigns would look like. And again, because the United States as a kind of ideological power has always had a view of how human history ought to turn out, responsible sovereigns that were democratic. Now, Africa, in this larger framework then, several problems present themselves. First of all, there's the issue of conflicts that are raging across the continent, and whether it is the DROC and the Great Lakes and efforts to bring an end to that conflict, or in Liberia, where in 2003, Charles Taylor was running amok in Liberia. I will never forget the pictures on the front pages of the New York Times of 13 and 14-year-old boys with AK-47s there on the front pages. And a decision then in July of 2003 to call for Charles Taylor's ouster, and then a sometimes little remembered fact, the United States actually sent 100 Marines to secure the ports and the airport during the time that Charles Taylor was being ushered out. But it was, in fact, one of the first real examples of cooperation between the United States and the then called the Organization of African Union. The OAU actually put forward peacekeeping forces under a Nigerian general and together secured the country with American Marines so that Charles Taylor would leave. I remember the pictures as if it were yesterday of Obasanjo and Kufuor of Ghana literally escorting him on an airplane in Mbeki of South Africa. I remember holding my breath till the plane took off. But in fact, Charles Taylor was gone. The UN then put in place a transitional government that then led 2 years later to the election of Ellen Johnson Sirleaf. And of course, perhaps the most important effort at conflict resolution, the 2005 CPA, the Comprehensive Peace Agreement between North and Southern Sudan, an agreement that was somewhat eclipsed by what would happen in Darfur, but an agreement that ended decades of fighting between the North and South that had cost literally millions of lives. But it was not just ending conflicts, it was the issue of building these responsible sovereigns. And in 2003, this idea of a Millennium Challenge came about. The idea there was to reward those states that were investing in people, fighting corruption, and who were engaging in democratic governance. And the United States of America made big bets on these countries. U.S. aid in 1996 was $1.65 billion. In 2008, it was $7.2 billion. So a threefold increase in assistance to Africa. Large bets, the assistance to 18 countries, 11 of which were in Africa, $870 million for Tanzania, for instance, $450 million for Ghana. So big bets on those states that were governing wisely. And of course, the compassion agenda, malaria, an effort to eradicate at least one half of the malaria cases in the world, and the best known, the President's Emergency Plan for AIDS Relief, where $15 billion in the initial grant and then over $50 billion now from the United States. And so emerged, I think, a vision for a democratic functioning Africa that could be more prosperous, that could take advantage of the African Growth and Opportunity Act, which had been signed by the Clinton administration, to give Africa a place in the international community of states. And for the most part, we started to see the emergence in Africa of democratic leaders, mostly in smaller states, who were making a difference for their own people, who were governing in a way that was not corrupt, and who, perhaps most importantly in the African context, were willing to give up power when their terms of office ended. Kenya, for instance, turned out, despite tensions there in 2007, 2008, to be a good story, as Kenyan democracy actually triumphed despite a very bad election. But of course, there were many challenges: Sudan and Darfur, AU capacity, the big states of Africa, South Africa and Nigeria, unstable and incapable of really leading. And we had a few missteps, like the creation of AFRICOM, which was supposed to be a command for Africa that was just going to help Africans train for peacekeeping forces. And it was never meant to look like a command for Africa, but unfortunately was misinterpreted as a kind of recolonialization of Africa. It still exists. It exists under a very fine African-American general named Kip Ward, but AFRICOM never quite got off the ground. Now, I think that the last several years then have been ones in which U.S. policy could be said to have married interest and values in a way that American policy works best, advocating for democratic governance, advocating for anti-corruption, advocating for people being able to deliver for their own people, and doing so, of course, because it's in the U.S. interest to have responsible sovereigns in places like Africa. But let me just close with a couple of comments about some of the challenges ahead as that model tries to continue. And I think, by the way, it has been the model that is also there for the Obama administration. First of all, can this view of Africa survive the economic downturn through which we are all going? An economic downturn, by the way, that has not had a very devastating effect on African economies. African growth rates have been relatively stable. But where is the money going to come from for continued assistance to African governments that are doing the right thing? What is the debate going to look like in the US Congress or the German Parliament or the European Parliament about the role of development assistance in creating responsible sovereigns with the economic mess in which all of the developed world finds itself? What, too, will happen with the rise of another power in Africa, and that is China? China's role over the last several years in Africa has escalated quite quickly. Now, I think you can argue that mostly it has been a policy that is aideological and rather mercantilist. It's really been about the search for resources to fuel the 12% growth that China needs to grow 25 million jobs a year, which is what Hu Jintao told us he needs for, quote, the harmonious society in China. So you can see that for China, this is essentially a resource play. But what does that mean for Africa? What does that mean in terms of governance? What does that mean in terms of the demands that China is or is not willing to make on African leaders in terms of corruption or the like? And just one little vignette that was not a happy one. During one of the last trips that I took, I was in Ethiopia, and I was sitting with President Mellish, and we looked out, and there is this huge palatial building being built. And I said to him, "What is that?" He said, "Oh, that's the headquarters for the new headquarters for the African Union." I said, "Oh, it's quite good looking." And he said, "Yes, the Chinese have built it." And I couldn't help but think that for the African Union, which actually has trouble putting peacekeepers on the ground in the DROC, the building of a palatial new palace headquarters in Addis Ababa seemed a bit misplaced. Nonetheless, China will be a factor, and the question is, will the international system, and more importantly, will African leaders hold China accountable for the kind of assistance that is given? There is some backlash against the tendency for the Chinese to let contracts and then bring Chinese labor to execute those contracts rather than bringing labor on the ground. So I think that the future for U.S. and indeed developed world involvement in Africa is a bit cloudy. Nonetheless, I think that you can make the argument that in practical terms, it is extremely important that the United States and others stay on this course. It's high time that Africa stopped being a place of high potential. It's been a place of high potential for a really long time. It's more than time that that potential be realized. It's also high time that Africans, as they are trying to do, take responsibility for where Africa is going and deliver for their people. You will not have democratic governments in Africa for very long if they cannot deliver for their people. But particularly from the American point of view, I want to close with a comment that goes back a bit to W.E.B. Du Bois. You know, I was in Africa several times. And each time, as I went to some place where perhaps my ancestors might have been, I found myself feeling that I was going home to a place that I'd never been. If you have that sense if you've ever been to someplace that was like that for you. And I said in a speech to an AGOA forum that I thought that the United States of America had, starting with President Clinton and then through President Bush and now with President Obama, finally come to terms with the fact that the United States of America was built as a country with the stolen sons and daughters of Africa. After all, we came to this country as founding populations, Europeans and Africans, Africans in chains. And this realization, this recognition that the stolen sons and daughters of Africa had been fundamental in the building of this country was important not just in our willingness and our desire and our obligation to help Africa, but it had been very important to the coming to terms with the American idea as well. After all, ironically, the founding documents of the United States that promised equality for all, the founding documents that said "we the people," of course, didn't mean me when that was said. And it was the descendants of those very stolen sons and daughters of Africa that would redeem America in the civil rights movement and would redeem America in making those words true and would redeem America in making it finally a union in which we could finally say "we the people" and mean all the people. And somehow that psychic connection between Africa and the United States, I think, is extremely important. That's why I hope, despite all of our problems, that Africa will not again fall from the radar screen. It is important, not just to the diaspora here, but it is important to the American idea that that redemption continue. And perhaps that's what W.E. Du Bois was really saying. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Secretary Rice. Can only imagine what you're like when you haven't just flown from Korea. We now have time for questions from the audience. There are 4 microphones, one right here, another up there, a third there, and a fourth there. I'd encourage you to spread around since I'll just go around. There are 3 rules for a good question at the Kennedy School. The first is that you identify yourself. The second is that you keep it short and it contain one thought. And the third is that it end with a question mark. And so with those 3 missives in mind, let me start right here.
Thank you, Secretary Rice. I don't know if this is on, but Josh Zagorski, Harvard College, I'm a senior. My question is, should international law allow mercenaries to operate in Africa and the rest of the world, and why or why not?
Well, depends a little bit on the definition of mercenary. In fact, if contract workers, the like, contract security, I know there have been concerns about that. But I think the real problem with mercenaries, for instance, being hired to do the hard work in a conflict, is that they're unaccountable. And in the 21st century, accountability of governments to their people is something that ought to be at the center of any choices that we make and any solutions that we come to. It's one reason that when it came to what might we do for peacekeeping forces, not just forces that would come from other parts of the world, but forces that would themselves come from Africa, we kept it firmly tied to governments, not to some more ubiquitous point of view. I don't know that international law or the international system can do much about it when actually mercenaries do operate, but since they're unaccountable, probably not a good idea.
Next question is right up here.
Thank you, Secretary Rice. My name is Sagal Abshir. I am a mid-career student here at the Kennedy School. You mentioned the U.S. experience in Somalia in 1992-93, And then in 2001, the need to really look at the issue of failed states and try to, I guess, ensure that they weren't around. I guess given that Somalia is now coming on, 20 years of failed state, and that the US is struggling with how to engage with it, what do you see as the future of that and what can Somalis do?
Yes. Well, in order to have any chance to help a failed state heal, you have to have a plausible indigenous governing body. And it's why, whether it is Afghanistan or the Balkans, people look first to, or Liberia, people look first to some kind of transitional government. And the problem in Somalia has been that it has been extremely difficult to get that done. I spent a lot of time, I went to Addis Ababa to a summit to try and bring a Somali government in and give it regional support. I mean, one thing that you can do to substitute for the strength of a government like that is you can give it regional support. But of course, then you get into problems between Eritrea and Ethiopia because the region is not very stable. I still think that the best bet for Somalia is to continue to try to work toward some kind of transitional government that can slowly build authority. There is some concern about whether with such a weak government you should, for instance, train security forces. But I see no other option but to train security forces for a government like that, or you will have, as the gentleman said, mercenaries, or you will have regional powers constantly poking in. And finally, as much as Ethiopia is a problematic state, you've got to work with Ethiopia to try to bring some stability in that region. It's really too early to even talk about economic development for Somalia because there's no government there with which to work. And so I think those efforts are really the ones that are going to have to continue. And perhaps Somalis can come together around that. There's been talk from time to time that perhaps Somaliland should secede or whatever. I see that as just more trouble. I think you have to try and build a central government there.
Right up here.
Hello. I welcome you to our school.
Thank you.
And I guess some of us really wanted to meet you and have a lot of questions for you. WikiLeaks is the news of the day, and apparently it shows that Americans know the fundamental roots of terrorism and Al-Qaeda to some of its very close and friendly states. And let alone these states have human rights problem. These states are not democratic. And I remember those days that you had transformational democracy strategy in Middle East, and you were in power. I wonder if America is still that ideological country you say. What is the future strategy? Mm-hmm. What is the leverage toward these countries?
Yes. Thank you. Well, it is absolutely the case that the United States sometimes has to deal with countries that are not democratic. We have to do so sometimes for security reasons. We have to do so for larger diplomatic reasons. But we should never lose sight of the fact that in the long run, the United States is better off as democracies progress and as authoritarians recede. And that means that even if you are dealing with authoritarian states, you ought to be doing everything that you can to encourage change and to empower those who might bring change. So that, for instance, the efforts in the Middle East, I think, have been helped tremendously by support for civil society, support for women's groups, support for environmental groups, support for university groups, support for students coming here to the United States to study. One of the big problems after September 11th was we virtually cut ourselves off from student exchange, and it was a big mistake. And we tried to rebuild that, and I think it's begun. But you should never lose sight of the fact that in the long run, your interests and your values are going to have to come together. Now, in some states, like Yemen, for instance, which is a very important front on the war on terror, we had a lot of tensions with Yemen, not just about the war on terror, but about issues of democracy. And we were forthright with Yemen about the need to improve its human rights record, despite the fact that it has an insurgency in both the north and south. And I think that that's the way that you have to be. But unfortunately, the United States is not an NGO. And so it is never going to have pure policies in terms of dealing only with democracies. That won't work. When you are dealing with authoritarians, particularly if they are your allies, though, you owe it to the people who may be trying to build indigenous support for more democracy to support them in any way that you can and to consistently advocate on their behalf with the governments with which you're dealing.
Right over here.
Thank you, Secretary Rice, for being here. My name is Kiki, and I have a question and a comment. The question is, what's the benefit to the United States of America to have responsible sovereign states in Africa? And the comment is in relation to Africa not being a continent or not being a country, but yet it seemed or it came across throughout your talk as if Africa is actually a country, because the presentation really was Africa, each time Africa versus Ghana, Nigeria, and etc.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Well, and the benefit to the United States of responsible sovereignty is, I think, first and foremost, the benefit is to Africans of responsible sovereigns in Africa, because those are countries, for instance, that can deliver on food for their people, can deliver on education for their people, can deliver on health for their people. So that's the first and most important goal. But for the international system, not just the United States, but for the international system is built on the expectation that you will be able to govern and you will be able to control your borders, for instance. Now, we know that that's imperfect in most places, but some places are much worse than others. The young lady who mentioned Somalia. We almost had a war in December of 2007 because Somalia was unable to deal with its borders, and Ethiopia saw the threat from what was happening with the collapse of Somalia. So the international system is very much dependent on responsible sovereigns. That, in addition to it being good for the peoples. The reason that I talk about Africa is I could have talked about U.S. policy toward Europe and would have done the same, even though I know there's a policy toward Germany that Europeans would like to think it's all toward Europe, but actually there are countries within Europe as well, as we're learning in this recent crisis. But on Africa, one thing that we tried to do with, for instance, the Millennium Challenge was to differentiate in Africa by whether or not a country and its leadership was governing wisely, whether it was investing in its people. So Ghana got a $450 million plus grant from the United States. Not true of countries that did not have that profile. And so you're right that you have to deal with African countries on their own merits. You also have to deal with them on their own circumstances. But regionalization is happening all over the world. It's not just in Africa. It is true that the Organization of American States is trying to have a more regional approach in Latin America, that the European Union has taken regionalization, of course, to its most highly articulated level. So I don't think that there's anything wrong with Africa trying to act in unity through the organization of, through the African Union. But you're right that anybody addressing Africa in terms of policy needs to be very aware of the different histories, the different peoples, and the different circumstances in which you are dealing.
Right over here.
Yes. Dr. Rice, thank you so much for being here tonight. I'm Katie Peters. I'm a master's candidate here at the Kennedy School. I'm a security studies person, so if you'd like to comment a little bit on growing terrorist networks in North Africa, I'd love to hear it. But more in the spirit of your speech, I'm also a tech geek. Some of the real areas of innovation we've gotten to see are actually crowdsourced crisis response. Shahidi came out of violence in Kenya after elections that you alluded to. Mobile money is really growing beautifully, both in Kenya and Nigeria these days. You're talking about looking forward, and you're working with both politics and business right now, and I dare ask this at the School of Government, but what sectors and what areas are you seeing the most room for hope, and where would you be investing right now with your time and energy?
Well, I'm an academic, so investment
Time
is
and
a
energy.
long-term prospect. Look, I think that the most interesting question right now for all governments around the world is, can you mobilize human potential in a way that gives full flight to its creativity and its ability to innovate? And I happen to live in a place that is very innovative and very creative. I live in Silicon Valley. And what's remarkable about it is that people keep coming up with new ideas that when you look at them in retrospect, you think, oh yeah, of course. But if you'd looked at them at that moment, you would think, that's never going to work. I mean, who's ever going to need to have their own personal computer? What a dumb idea that is. Who's going to need to have a
street here.
Pardon me?
Some of that happened just down the street.
Yeah,
here,
128 is a great look. Route 128, Silicon Valley, Austin. There are real pockets of this around the country. The interesting thing for us sitting here in a great university is that they often are places that can connect the innovation and the creativity and the just pure brain power of great universities to that desire to commercialize and make money. It is actually one of the great benefits of capitalism to be able to draw on that innovation and creativity in a very real and very fast way. I have no idea where the next great frontiers are, but one of the wonderful joys of being provost of Stanford was that I used to read the faculty files that would come through, and you get to read the files that are at the cutting edge of every technology, and you look at what people are imagining, not just in the information technology, social media, and so forth, but what they're imagining in biomedical research and what is happening with the ability to take personalized medicine from what we learned from the human genome. I mean, it is endless what the human mind seems to be able to do. For a school of government, the interesting question is, what governing systems are most going to unleash that creativity? And I'll take my bets on free societies. I'm very often asked, when will China surpass the United States in terms of global economic and global political leadership? Because if you do it global economy, you'll do it politically as well. And I almost always end with the following question to people who ask. China is a tremendous miracle. I was there in 1988. The streets of Beijing were a competition between a few horse carts, a few cars, and a lot of bicycles. That's not Beijing today, so it's an amazing place. But ask yourself this, can a country that is so terrified of the internet that it is hacking into people's computers to find just that last human rights advocate lead the knowledge revolution? And I don't think so. So from the governing point of view, I'll take my bets on free peoples given the opportunity to give full flight to their imaginations. And because I'm not a techie, I have no idea where those imaginations are going to lead them.
Right up here.
Yes.
Secretary Rice, my name is Samuel from Ghana, where Dr. Du Bois spent the last few years of his life and made an impression on the country. But my question concerns Southern Sudan.
Yes.
On 9th January 2011, Southern Sudan will have a referendum. Much of the discussions and the negotiations happens when you were National Security Advisor or when you were the Secretary of State. We had a similar situation between Eritrea and Ethiopia, and there were a lot of expectations. These expectations died soon after the referendum and Eritrea's independence. I want to have some assurances from you that during the Southern Sudan negotiation, which I know you play a very good part in. Did you consider the Eritrea experience and made some mechanisms there that we are not going to see a renewed tension, a renewed hostility between Southern Sudan and then the main Sudan after 9?
Yes,
June?
well, it was certainly thought of that the prospect of a referendum on separation in 2011 had the prospect for violence and for a rather chaotic outcome. That was certainly thought of. Nonetheless, it was believed, and I think rightly, that without that prospect of the referendum and a decision as to Southern Sudan's future, it was not going to be possible to get a comprehensive peace agreement that would allow the killing to stop and allow people to begin to try to develop. Of course, the mechanism that was put into place was to build a unified government for that intervening period, which was to try and deal with some of the more difficult issues that were not, frankly, dealt with in the negotiations themselves. For instance, the distribution of oil revenue, there was a basic formula, but precisely how it was going to be done was left to further negotiations, particularly in some of the most sensitive oil-rich areas. So there was a lot of work to do between 2005 and 2011, and I do have to say that I think that the problem in Darfur tended to, it didn't set aside what was being done in the CPA, but it certainly turned the attention of the world and the governments away from really moving that CPA those interim arrangements forward. And so now we have very little time to make those arrangements work. I know that the Obama administration, and particularly Susan Rice at the UN, is very much active in, and their envoy for Sudan, very much active in trying to move those issues forward. But there is no doubt that we lost a lot of time between 2005 and 2011 in trying to tie down all of those aspects that were left unresolved with the negotiations when they ended in 2005. I have to say, too, I think the Southern Sudanese leadership has recovered from the death of John Garang, but it took a while. And now I think there's a good leadership there that's doing its very best, but time is running out.
Right over here.
Hi, thanks for visiting us here. I'm John Soyler from Turkey. I'm a freshman at the college. Yes. And I had a question about the concept of responsible sovereignty in failed states you mentioned, especially in the cases where military intervention is considered. People raise questions of legitimacy, and there are those people out there that ask, what gives the U.S. the right to do this? And often it's the Security Council or procedures through the UN. But the past 2 decades have shown that those procedures might sometimes fail, and the U.S. might need to move in regardless of that. How can issues of legitimacy be addressed in situations like that?
Yes, it's a very difficult problem because I absolutely it would be best if every military intervention were backed up by a unanimous Security Council resolution. That would be the best circumstance. Doesn't happen. Didn't happen in the Balkans. Didn't happen in Iraq. By the way, did happen in Afghanistan, but did not happen in Iraq. Despite the fact that in both the Balkans and in Iraq, you had multiple Security Council resolutions that had been violated by the regimes in power. And so at some point, somebody takes the decision that it is not going to, that the world can wait no longer. Now, I think it's rare, by the way, that, maybe never, that you take a decision to use military force to create a responsible sovereign or to create a democratic responsible sovereign. You use military force to deal with the security threat. It would be like saying we went to war against Adolf Hitler to create a democratic Germany. That's not why we went to war with Adolf Hitler. It's not why we went to war with Saddam Hussein. But once that has happened, then you have to have a view about what is going to be the fate of those people, and that's where the concept of responsible sovereignty comes in. I think it helps if even if there is disagreement about the legitimacy, if you will, of military action, it helps after the fact to have the United Nations involved. And in both the Balkans and in Iraq, you had the UN go in with a mission. The UN has overseen elections in Iraq. I think that's been tremendously legitimizing for the emergence of an Iraqi government. And so given that the Security Council isn't always going to act in concert, it's probably the case that sometimes you're going to see post hoc legitimation as the Security Council agrees to deal with the longer-term consequences of whatever military action has taken place.
Thank you.
I'm afraid we have time for just two more questions. Will be this one and this one. We'll start here to the right.
To the right. There you are. Okay.
Thank you. My name's Nabiha Sashdina, and I'm a master's student here at the Kennedy School. You mentioned in your speech the value of democratisation, and through your experience, you've obviously been involved both in more overt methods of democratisation and the more measured ways of doing so. And I'd just be interested to hear your perspectives of the relative successes and challenges of those two methods, and whether there is still a case for overt democratisation going forward, and whether that's likely to be an ongoing feature of US foreign policy, particularly given sustainability concerns.
Yes, thank you. I personally think that overt advocacy for democratization is extremely important. Now, the danger with overt democratization or overt advocacy for democratization is that people can easily interpret it to mean that you think it's going to happen tomorrow. I gave the speech in Cairo in 2005, and looking back over that speech about democracy in the Middle East, I wonder if somehow I gave the impression either that we thought it would happen immediately, or, as I said to the gentleman earlier, that the United States was simply not going to deal with Egypt until it was a democracy. Neither of those was true. But I think even with those dangers, somebody has to advocate overtly for democratization, and somebody has to overtly support democratization. I know that elections, for instance, are not a panacea for democratic development. A lot has to happen after elections, and I've very often heard people say, well, two things they say. First of all, you can't, you need to have a civil society develop first, and you need to have economic development, you need to have all of these things before democratization before elections take place. And the problem is, I've never understood how habits of democracy develop in authoritarian circumstances. And so you therefore have to go for it. And sometimes those elections will even produce, from the point of view of US interest, bad results, like the Hamas victory in the Palestinian parliamentary elections in 2006. Nonetheless, is the answer then that the Palestinian people then ought to have to wait until somehow some magic thing happens so that those elections will come out in a different way? So I favor overt democratization. Now, it is absolutely the case that some things are better done quietly. And I worry, in the news of the day, that some of the people with whom the U.S. and others work more quietly in extremely difficult circumstances to try to bring about change may be exposed if, in fact, their names are leaked all over. People take risks to bring democracies to their own countries. So sometimes it does have to be quiet. But for the most part, I think there's nothing wrong with the overt advocacy of democratization.
This will be the last question.
Yes. Well, thank you, Dr. Rice, and thank you, Dean Elwood, for having my question. My name is Chenny Yoon. I'm from South Korea, studying public policy here at the Kennedy. I was just in Rwanda this past summer, where they boast the world's highest female representation in parliament. And you today talked a lot about democratic governance. And I was wondering, where do you see women's role in enhancing democratic governance in Africa?
Yes.
And along that line, what would your one advice be for young women in politics,
Yes.
who will carry the adjectives like the first, the second, and so on, and who possibly represent certain minority group?
Yes.
Thank you.
Yes. Well, let me start with the last. First of all, I am delighted that there are young women who want to consider public service there's nothing quite like public service. in the years that I've served in government, and I've never been elected to anything except president of my family, so I'm not. It's not an elected thing, but public service is like no other experience because you get to try to do something that's bigger than yourself, and you get to do it with other people who are sacrificing to do it as well. And you know, when we impugn the motives of our public service servants, I think we make a mistake because most people who go into public service because they want to make a difference. They want to make things better, and they will make mistakes, and they'll do things with which we don't agree, and sometimes they will stumble very badly, but mostly they do things out of the right motives. And so I would say, go for it. Find your first experience in public service. One of the problems with folks your age at this point is that you want to know what you're going to be doing 15 years from now or 20 years from now. Planning it out. Just figure out what the next best step is, and then be open to the possibility that pathways may open that you never expected. And so find that job or that internship or that fellowship that's going to give you that experience in public service and see where it leads you. But politics is really, really hard. The political life is really, really hard. But it is tremendously fulfilling. And another way to think about it is in democratic societies, if people don't take the risk of doing public service, then democracies can't flourish. And so I encourage you to do exactly that. And you wanted me to talk about
Women's role in democratic governance in Africa.
Yeah, women's empowerment, right? If I could wave a magic wand and do just one thing, I would empower women worldwide, and I'll tell you why. It is absolutely the case, and we now know it, there's data that represents it, that societies that treat women badly are actually dangerous societies. Forget the fact that they're not going to reach their potential. You're not going to reach your potential by suppressing half of your population. But forget that fact. They are dangerous societies. Something's wrong when a society mistreats half of its population. Now, the empowerment of women politically is the first step, because without the right to vote and to exercise their choices, women are not going to be able to defend themselves and advocate for themselves. So the first thing is, do they have political rights? And in most of the world they do, but in some of the world they still don't. Secondly, educate women. If you educate women, and you want to do something about the population problem in certain places, educate women and they won't have babies at age 12 and they won't have 12 kids, I guarantee you. If you educate women, they will not allow themselves to be trafficked in the sex trade. If you educate women, they will find a way to take a $500 microloan and empower a whole village and help build a national economy. So political empowerment, education, and then making certain that women can exercise those rights. Now, in developed societies, we're seeing more and more women in very high places. Chancellor of Germany to the president of Liberia. And I guarantee you, there will be an American woman president before too long, because you're starting to see women in the pools from which we take our presidents. Americans elect their presidents from governors and senators. So it's not surprising that Sarah Palin was a governor and Hillary Clinton was a senator. We will start to see women move into those positions in developed societies. But even in places that are not developed and places where women have not been empowered, they're making their move. Women have the right to vote in Kuwait, and they gave me a wonderful T-shirt. It said, "Half a democracy is not a democracy at all," and I thought it was a great saying. But even in those places where it seems quite dark, I'll tell you a story. You know, people have asked me, what's it like to be Secretary of State and go to countries where women are second class or worse, like in places in the Middle East? Well, I can assure you, if you're Secretary of State, they get over it pretty fast because they really don't want to tick off the American Secretary of State. But quite apart from that, I remember one particular meeting, and Megan O'Sullivan is here, who worked with me on Iraq, with a Shia cleric in Iraq, a very conservative man who couldn't shake my hand because I was a woman. And at the end of our meeting, he said, "Oh, but you know, I'd really like you to meet my 13-year-old granddaughter." I thought, okay. And out comes this little covered girl who says that she wants to be foreign minister too. And the amazing thing was the degree to which her grandfather just beamed, right? So even for these extremely conservative men, maybe there's a different place that we're going with women. So I think it's a very hopeful future for women. It's a very hopeful future for democratic politics, but it's an especially hopeful future if women and democratic politics come together. Thanks a lot. Thank you.
So that's the first of three. Tomorrow night, Secretary Rice will speak on multi-ethnic democracy. Is the American experience unique? That's going to be at Asquith Hall. I think your call to service is particularly appropriate given that we have a group of people that have responded to that. I look forward to seeing you tomorrow morning. And I also want to thank Skip Gates for not only what you've done for this university, its students, and its faculty, but for the country and the world. And most importantly, I want to thank our guest, Condoleezza Rice. Thank you all. Have a wonderful evening. Thanks for being here.
Oh, that was sweet.